Academia can feel like a one-way street. You start with grad school, tenure, and then back to school, at school forever. I mean, do we have to? I mean, we chose to, but is this the only option? So what if you don't want that? What if you don't want to stay? What happens next?
So today on Not That Kind of Doctor, we're joined by Dr. Julie Rust and Dr. Dave Lewis, two former academics who have made bold moves outside of the ivory tower. One's helping lead an independent school, while the other is shaping knowledge at the Library of Congress.
And here's the twist. When you're thinking about what is your future, it's not just about finding a job. It's about really redefining what you want and what is your title. Because if you go the academic job, it's very clear. You're going to be an instructor or a professor or a researcher. But here, it's a little bit different. And how do you navigate this?
Yeah, so if you've ever wondered about how to think about life outside of academia, what are the possibilities, what could that look like, or if it's even possible for you, you're in the right place. My name's Nick Husbye. I'm an associate professor of elementary literacy education here at UNL.
And I'm Guy Trainin, professor of education here at UNL.
And this is Not That Kind of Doctor. All right, so today we're branching out. We're trying new things, and we have guests, people who want to talk to us, or I coerced into talking to us.
It's good to have friends.
Checks are in the mail. So before we dive into conversations about jobs outside of academia, I would love to give both Julie and Dave a chance to introduce themselves and share a little bit about how they got to where they are and where they think they're going. So, Julie, would you mind starting out? Tell us about your current role, what led you there, and your kind of experience in academia before making the shift.
Thanks, Nick. Well, once upon a time, I used to be a grad student with Nick. In fact, my very first grad school class, I didn't know how to find peer-reviewed articles, really. And Nick was like, Julie, there's this thing called Google Scholar. Have you heard of it? Might help you. Might be really important in grad school. This is a trajectory I took, right? And so in grad school, I think a lot of us are like, hey, I'm going to be a professor. I'm getting my PhD. Both of my parents, professors, fun fact. So it was really embedded in me. This is kind of a great job in terms of life balance and flexibility and doing the thing you love. And so that was my plan. And I, while in grad school doing the interviews, got a job in a place I didn't really anticipate, Jackson, Mississippi, at a really small liberal arts school called Millsaps College. And, I wasn't sure if this question of do I accept a job that comes to me? Do I stay on the job market? It was kind of early in the season. But I had happened to just have given birth to my third child about 2 weeks before the job offer. And so I felt a little bit like, you know what, I could go on the job hunt with a newborn in tow, or I could just accept this job at this sweet little school. So I did that. And honestly, it was a wonderful 5 years working with very small cohorts of students. And I think one really important thing for folks to understand early in their careers is it's not as though academia is one size fits all either. I don't even know if I would call what I did at Millsaps academia. I mean, I certainly was writing, but I was teaching a lot. I was doing a ton of service and advising and participating in building programmatic things. And to be very honest, a lot of what I did then and what I do now is identical. And so that's one thing I kind of want to disrupt is this binary of academia is one thing, and then you leave academia and it's a separate thing. I mean, I actually think a lot of these jobs are really blurry. And perhaps it feels starker if you're at an R1 where I think the academia side is more heavily emphasized, and it's you are a researcher, you're only teaching one course or whatever. But really my job was primarily teaching. I was doing some writing, doing some research. And then came the news, as has come to many a small liberal arts school, that they were cutting their education program. And so I was at a bit of a crossroads where I was offered a teaching and learning gig at the college to kind of work on faculty development, or I was essentially called to come work at my kid's school. It's K-12 independent school here in Jackson, Episcopal school. And there was just something about it that kind of like got me excited, right? Like, and I think all of us in the field of education, which again, this question of what's academia and what's not, but those of us in the field of education, I think, are constantly, when you're a professor, you're looking for sites for research and sites for getting your practicing teachers into schools. And this notion of actually working in the site was exciting for me in terms of like enacting change and being able to be around the energy of K-12. And so when I was first hired, I was at this strange title. I think they called it associate head of teaching innovation. I don't know. It was an interesting title. And I reported to the middle and upper school head. And I just really was in classrooms a ton, coaching teachers. I was making some academic-y decisions, but mid-level. I was very middle management, and it was really, really fun to make the switch from like 20-year-old undergrads and reminding them, you can be an adult, you can be an adult, which was primarily the job of pre-service education at Millsaps. I mean, not just that, but to actually working with like full grown-ups who were very much like, hey, you say this thing about education, but my experience proves this. Fight me, you know? And it was this like sort of challenge that folks bring to this work. And again, that might not have been such a stark difference if I had been doing tons of like doctoral level work with students, even master's level, you're often working with practicing teachers, but my job was primarily undergrad previous. And so I have really enjoyed the move to admin in a shocking way. I really planned on doing it 1 year and getting back into the professor market. Shockingly, the job market isn't that easy to get back into. I don't know if anyone's heard that. It's shocking. Even if you're spectacular and amazing, like Dave and I are, obviously. But even more than that, I mean, like my kids had now at this point lived here for 6 years. My husband was ingrained in a community here. And I found myself continually challenged and stimulated in ways that I really kind of wasn't in my previous job. I've certainly grown more in the last 5 years and it's kind of a good time to talk to y'all because 5 years in the job as an assistant professor of education, and now I'm entering my 6th year here in some sort of administrative role. My new role now is assistant head of school for academics. It's sort of shifted throughout. So now I'm doing more whole school, big picture things. But yeah, so long intro, really excited about this conversation.
Excellent. So Dave, what about you? Talk us through kind of your pathway, because you're outside of education. You're coming from a different kind of area. Where were you and how did you get to where you are?
All right. Well, in thinking about this, I realized I have left academia twice.
Oh, bonus!
The first time, Nick and Julia and I were all in grad school at the same time, although I was in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology at Indiana. And about the time I was finishing up my PhD, the job market for ethnomusicologists was really, really not great. And so I played this giant game of chicken for many years. Like, I'm almost done with the document, but I don't want to finish quite yet because there's, so I'm sure you all have students who have played that game. So I was doing that for a bit, and I had worked my way through school, working in archives on the IU campus, including the IU Archives of Traditional Music, where I really got my hands into that world. I mean, that was my whole training in archiving at that point. But I was good at it. And I liked it. And when I finished, I got so many more bites for those skills than I did for the PhD. So I left academia the first time and went to work for 2 years at a small, medium-sized history museum in Bristol, Tennessee / Virginia. And it was a great time. I got to open a museum. Who gets to do that? It was so much fun. It was so exhausting. I never want to do it again. But I got some really good experience. I got to sort of learn firsthand and show myself that, like, partly because I had finished the PhD, I'd done all this research, I had all these skills, I could teach myself new things. I couldn't get a foothold in archives, libraries, and museums without the MLS, without yet another degree. And I dragged my feet for a little bit, but finally found a quick 3-semester program where I could get credentialed. And halfway through that program, I landed a tenure track librarian position in Northwest Ohio, doing the same thing kind of that I'd done while on the IU campus, working with sound recordings as an information professional. I was going to probably teach a little bit. And because it was tenure track, I had to publish, but I could also publish from my ethnomusicology work. So it seemed kind of perfect, kind of tailor-made. I mean, it was in Ohio. That was probably not exciting for my husband, but we made the move. And I stayed there just long enough to get tenure before I realized that, maybe this wasn't actually where I wanted to end my career. And there were several reasons for that. One of them really was location. My parents are getting older, my brother's having kids, and it was a long trek from Ohio all the way back to Virginia. And public transport in the Midwest is not great. Just transport options in general, not great. So that just made it difficult. But also, I felt like I had felt at the museum. There was always more and more and more being piled on. We lost an entire position in my very small unit while I was there, and everything just got redistributed. And there was more service and just more stuff being piled on. I was teaching full classes as well, which I was not doing when I started, and looked like I was going to have to do that without being paid more. That was just sort of part of my job. And I agreed to that partly because it seemed like a good way to make sure I kept my job. They were really pushing librarians to teach full courses more and more and more and more. So I was like, fine, I just go ahead and do it, and they don't pay me any more for it. That I'm not going to be first on the chopping block if anything weird happens.
Mm-hmm.
But about when I was approaching tenure, it's kind of a decision point. And I went ahead and applied for tenure, of course. And I did it early. I finished. I got it. But I was like, I don't think this is actually where I want to end up. So I looked very selectively for jobs, and I surprised myself because most of the jobs were not in academia. I looked at large public library systems. I looked at the government. I looked at sort of mostly jobs outside of academia, and they were all stretch jobs. And I was, after my previous time on the job market, I was kind of shocked that I got interviews for most everything, which was really validating and very exciting. I didn't get interviews for the lateral jobs, but for the ones that I was like, oh, I don't know if I could, it worked out. And so, I landed here about a year and a half ago. I'm now at the Library of Congress at the National Audio-Visual Conservation Center, which is a campus not in DC. We're out in Culpeper, Virginia. It is where LOC puts all of their audio, video, and film materials. So I am heading a small unit that processes archival sound recordings and manuscripts for the recorded sound section. So I still have my fingers in the same stuff that I had my fingers in when I was a grad student. I just found a way to make that a career almost by accident.
Well, but it also seems like both of you made some pretty specific changes, right? Like, I keep thinking back to grad school and how myopic, almost, dare I say, like cult-like sometimes graduate school can feel. Like, you will be a professor, you're going to work in academia, you're going to get tenure, R1, R1, R1. And I'm fascinated by like those moments where you decided how to leave or to leave. Like, Julie, in your case, you had this opportunity to kind of stay in a different kind of position and you left. Dave, seems like you were having this internal conversation about, is this where I want to be? Is this an organization that I want to be part of? I would love to know a little bit more about what were the inner criteria? Like, what were your quit criteria for like, oh, I need to make this change. I need to move on. This is it. I'm done.
Wow, that's a good question.
I have them every once in a while. It's every once in a while.
And it's one that's hard to answer because I feel like, like the seeds for what I'm doing now were really planted so early. And so for me, it was just like this long process of realizing, oh wait, this is really what I should be doing, right? I mean, this is sort of like what the universe keeps driving me towards.
Oh gosh, are we manifesting, Dave? Is this what this is?
I don't know. But like even
Is this a different podcast than I thought?
Well, we'll get out the crystals in a second.
I read my tarot.
But like even my dissertation, like it was a sort of medical ethnomusicology dissertation. Like I had the chance to make that practical. I had the chance to like pivot there into sort of like the outside world, and I really dug my heels in and resisted that. Partly because like that was at that time not the done thing. I will say I do think especially a lot of like humanities and arts PhDs or terminal degrees are doing a better job. Not that I had a bad experience, but they are being much more like concerted about giving their students a path outside of academia while they're still in grad school.
Mm-hmm.
So, classes about arts admin or sort of, like public facing stuff.
It's partially because there are less jobs. So the answer is much more obvious that we can't just say to everybody, be a professor, because there just aren't enough positions out there to answer all of that need. But I think you're right that in education, we are very much in a similar position.
What's so interesting about that question is I think like every decision we make is a constellation of forces imposed on us and agency we take around those forces, right? And so it is, to bring back the crystals, it is very much the two at work together. In my personal experience, I probably just mentioned my kids 4 times in my intro, right? So for me, the fact that I'm not I almost could guarantee if I didn't have 3 kids and a partner, like I probably would still be a professor, is my guess. I don't know. But that's my guess. And it was sort of the ways in which their realities sort of shaped the decisions that I made. And I'm not mad about it, but I will say, like, I'm still choosing every day whether this is what I want to do. I feel like I want the narrative of this podcast to be like, and Nick, I'm reading the book, Leaving Academia, that you have recommended. I want my narrative to be like that book, which is like, it's awesome and like, yay, but I still feel often like I failed. I mean, and this is my tendency. If you were to know me well, I'm pretty tough on myself. I'm pretty much like, let's look back at what could have been and like torture yourself for years and years for no reason, even though everything's actually pretty happy. But it is a real like everyday decision if I'm going to be real, even though I'm definitely making more money than I would be if I were still a professor. I'm definitely in many ways growing every day, learning more skills. I feel like I'm making a more practical impact on the daily than I was and again, just at my particular context before, where I only often had 7 or 8 students in a class. Like I can name the ways I'm now able to really write in ways that I enjoy, like the blog with the teachers, doing this dumb podcast that I do with my faculty. Like I'm able to take a lot of
this dumb podcast. She points to us.
Yes. So I mean, I think like logically, I can tell you all the reasons why this move has been good for my family. I now have the same schedule. Probably one of my 3 kids would have popped in here by now, going from a class to another class, but I have a sign up that says leave. So there's so many personal reasons why this has been a really special kind of cool moment in our lives for this season, right? And yet I still feel like I failed sometimes. And I really practically miss the flexibility of professoring. There's nothing, and I know that's not true for all professors, and I certainly worked really hard when I was at Millsaps, but like every day, I think when I first switched into this job, I was sending, Nick, you may remember this, I was sending like Post-it note pictures to my professor friends because I was so shocked by the number of meetings I had in a given day. I have mine right here to the right. And it's like, luckily I was able to make the podcast work. And then at 10:50, I'm in a classroom. At 11:30, I'm in a meeting. At 12:10, I'm supervising kids. At 1:10, I'm in a classroom. At 2:15, I'm meeting with the learning services. At 3:15, I'm working on proposals for a conference with other faculty leaders. Like every day, that's not like, oh, I have a busy day. That's like a very easy, common every day. Often I'll have 3 meetings on top of each other and I'm like going to part of a meeting. So like it's frenetic, which is both, yay, I'm pretty high energy and I enjoy the challenge and yay. And also like, holy cow, I just want to take a day off. And if I take one day off, it's like I have to screw up 12 people's lives. And so these are the tensions, I think, when we're talking through like what pushed you to this decision. Well, every day I'm still sort of deciding. And obviously all of us are trying to make our jobs more the thing we want them to be. So I really lean into the professory things, I think, in this job. And I really don't enjoy the parts that feel not professory. Yeah, no good answer.
Well, I mean, you just described our like years-long text messaging.
Right?
Like these are things that we've been talking about for years.
Mm-hmm.
But you bring up a good point around like there's things about, academia that influence who we want to be, like our personalities. And I would love to know from the two of you, you had these established careers that were in some way like defined by our roles. Like, I'm a professor. And then all of a sudden, all of these like character attributes are ascribed to me, right? Only like half of which, if that, are true. What has it been like to step away from that? And like Julie, you talk about this notion of failure, and Dave it sounds like you feel very empowered moving out of that. And the tensions between these two narratives is just fascinating to me. So I would love for you to like both talk about like some of the identity work that you're continuing to do and had to do as you shift out of academia.
And so for me, just to be a counterpoint to Julie a little bit, not to like invalidate her experience at all, but I am finding being out of academia freeing because like from being in grad school, we are sort of trained that we are swimming in this pool where our work is just always here, and I have my hands behind my head. No one can see it because this is a podcast, but it's like always waiting. It's always there. It always needs to be done. There's always something else,
Mm-hmm.
and it never shuts off. And one of the glorious things about my current gig is that more or less, I have to answer a couple emails or like if someone's going to be out, but when I leave the office, whenever I leave the office, 4:35, sometimes 3:30, I go in earlier, but I shut my laptop and I don't engage with anything until the next day if I don't want to. And that's and if I do work, an hour or two extra on a given day, I can get that time back. And that has felt like revelatory. So I'm enjoying the sort of built-in work-life balance where I am now. But even more than that, I am trying, not sure if it's working, but I am trying to bring my identity as like an ethnomusicologist, as a scholar, into the work that I'm doing now. I still have plans to do a couple publications, but I'm not on a tenure clock. The library likes people to publish, but like they don't care how often you do it. So I can do it on my own time. That means I also have to work on it on my own time, right? I have to work on it outside of work, but it's fine. But I am trying to still sort of bring that identity into my work, hopefully in a way that doesn't seem like snobby and eggheadish. So, but I really am trying. I still go to conferences every once in a while, not as much as I did, but I'm still active in folklore and ethnomusicology. And I also realize that I am very, very lucky to have a job that allows that flexibility. But that is to say then that these jobs are out there. Like you can find a job where you can like get rid of some of the parts of academia that are taxing, but hold on to, if you really enjoy the research and the presentations and that kind of academic back and forth, like there are ways to keep that. It just might take a little bit of creativity and a little bit of like bullheadishness on your part.
Fair.
So true. And yeah, this may be a podcast about, rather than leaving academia, and maybe a podcast about like 3 things, right? Like academia, admin, or what do we call what you do, David? Dave, very cool.
I mean, you can call it admin. I mean,
A very different admin.
People.
One weird admin, one cool admin. No, listen, I will say I go to way more conferences now than I did as an academic. So as an academic at Millsaps, I generally would go to 1 or 2 per year. I'm presenting more and I'm going to more conferences. The conferences are far more practical. I'm organizing one right now for academic leaders at schools similar to mine. And we're going through proposals. And I mean, again, I'm not sure how distinguish how different really my old job is with my new job when it comes down to it in lots of ways. And I think that's the distinguishing factor. But I will say this, a few times have, looked at other jobs, considered getting back into the professor time in my 6 years here at St. Andrews. And one thing I really have thought a lot about is, wait a minute, am I going to be able to go back to faculty status when right now, here's the big identity switch I've had is like this move into leadership, which is a field that really bugs me in lots of ways. But like everything, once you start doing it, you're like, oh, this is actually far more interesting and complex and whatever than I thought. And not everybody's a jerk like I thought they were, and some of them still are and still incompetent, but like, this is a fascinating, vast field, right? So I've essentially sort of entered a new field. And what came with that in terms of identity shift is, as a professor, my identity was 100% mentor, kindly, I dare I say almost motherly, because they were all like 19, 20, 21, motherly shepherd of future teachers into the classroom, and people crying in my office all the time, etc. Serving, feeling like I was doing service all the time and collaboration, right? Into this like role here where like the title itself makes sometimes people nervous to just come talk to me, which you guys can tell already on this podcast. I don't have that air of like, I'm intimidating. Like I have no, like, whatever, everything's hard. We're all doing our best. But like, just because of the title, there has been a big identity shift where I have to work a little bit for folks to know that I care and know that I'm not a jerk because of their past experiences, I think, with admin that have sort of, or that I'm not incompetent. And so like, again, I've been here now 6 years. That first year, there were some rocky moments. Now pretty much everybody's bought into me and sees me for who I am, which has affordances and constraints. Sometimes people are too comfortable. But I will say, I mean, I have had moments where I'm like, oh, so then I would have to give up being in the room where decisions are made. Like, I kind of don't know how well I would handle that. I feel like I would constantly be looking at the admin at the college if I were to go back to higher ed and be like, oh my gosh, run a meeting correctly. Or, how do you build a program? You're not even building a program. You haven't even talked to stakeholders. You can foster that in a much more, like I now have done enough of that. So like, I don't know, is it power? Is it that I'm now, I've had a taste of evil power? Yes, evil. But that has been a surprising identity shift. And I will say lots of times it feels gross. Like I don't enjoy when people seem nervous to talk to me. Like that is not inherent in, I have never been interested in that. So sometimes I like that part of this new identity. And sometimes I'm fighting actively to disrupt it and say like, no, I'm teaching a section of senior English. You saw how my students made a big mess the other day because I didn't manage it well. Like, let me constantly tell you how I screw up, but it's an interesting identity thing.
So As you're thinking about, you have made the move and started in academia, left academia, maybe twice left academia, which is double the experience. Really, as you're thinking about this, what is your advice to somebody who's contemplating whether they're graduate students? And we really encourage our graduate students, at least, to think beyond just academia. It's not the only option. And as Julie said, there's also a variety of institutions that are very, very different, and the job descriptions are very different in them. So what would be your advice to them, and what would be the first move?
For me, the thing that I always tell people who are sort of looking to pivot into anything, I mean, mostly people come to me for like library, archive, museum stuff. Number one, comb the job boards. Just look and see what jobs are out, what are they looking for, what kind of skills do they need, what kind of credentials, if any, are they asking for. Just get an idea of like what people are wanting, and do this way before you're on the job market. I mean, this is good advice no matter what, right? Even if you are staying in academia, but especially if you're trying to pivot out. Reading job ads can not only give you a little sort of microcosm of whatever the field is like, but it can also clue you in on some of the jargon that people are using in whatever field you're looking to pivot to. That's going to be really important, because as a grad student in whatever field that you're in, you are marinating in jargon. It has become second nature to you, at least in your chosen field. So to put on a new hat and pretend like you and not pretend like, and embody the fact that you are in this different field, and you'll be good for this job and you'll be able to get things done. You just need to speak their language. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, take meetings with people. Talk to anyone that you can that is in the field. Again, you have been in grad school for whatever you've been in for a long time, and you've developed some great networks that are probably not going to be as useful when you pivot. And you don't think of these meetings as networking, because then they'll be not useful. Just think of them as a chance to talk to people that are in the field, to get an idea of what they're doing, to get an idea of what skills they wish they had, maybe to get an idea of how you can, very quickly gain some of those skills before you're on the job market. And as you do that, if you're also meeting people and making connections that, who might hire you later, that's even better. But really, those conversations are for just getting an idea of the scope of the field and the duties, and making sure it's going to be a move that you're going to be happy about a year, 2 or 5 later.
I mean, I think what I would say, a couple of things. I mean, the one thing that I tell my students in high school, right, all the time is how curvy life is. Life is so curvy, right? And so just to in as much as you've built these projections of who you are and what you are, sort of the openness to that is really important. But I also think there is probably a reason our professors are pushing us into the academic job market so quickly out of grad school. And that's because you really are a bit more appealing to universities right out of grad school. There's some element of your PhD is new, especially if you've been at a decently, a reputable, whatever, R1 institution, especially if you've got some presentations under your belt. Your network with your professors is strong, so they can speak. So I don't want to just be do whatever you want. You can get back to professoring later. I want to say, if you really crave the work-life balance, which is so flexible, I promise, so much more flexible than maybe not Dave's job. Dave's job sounds pretty sweet, but I do think there is an element of if the life matches what you want. And those of you that are in the field of education, I think the job market is so much kinder than ethnomusicology. So it depends on your field. So you want to get a lay of the land, right? So there could be some reasons why going for that straight away out of grad school might still make sense. And I think that's awesome. But I do think then that openness to look and think as you proceed, what is the next curve in life going to bring me? And I think to, again, not think of these as bounded categories actually, I think that actually does some damage. I don't really want to be thought of as, well, Julie left academia. Like, well, I just submitted something to ed leadership and haven't heard back for a few months, which I hope means, it says under review. So we'll see, right? Like you can actively be part of academia despite the fact that you're not a professor. And I think depending on how you define like what academia is, maybe I don't want to leave that club, but my day job is really busy working with teachers. That's probably what I would be doing often as a college professor, right? I'd be doing research with teachers or doing some interventions with teachers. I mean, again, so like not, I think it's a harder riff, or it's a harder identity break to think like this thing is one thing and now you're out of this club. And I still find my grad school friends, who, by the way, all of my closest grad school friends are success stories. Like they're all really highly functioning. They're doing the thing you're supposed to follow, right? This like pathway. They're all tenure track, moved up, progressing in these great institutions that are stable. And I still find them incredibly supportive and helpful. So Dave's point is right. Like your network might change. Like they might not understand the realities of my life. And I certainly am not probably as helpful to them as I might have been had I stayed. But I still think those connections you make in grad school are incredibly powerful and can continue to fuel whatever thing you do. And I'm, often thinking about that too, like the ecology of people we meet and how things fuel you. And so, no one answer here, except to say, think about the life you want to. Just like, it's not just a job situation. It really is. I mean, Dave made such a good point about location. And being a professor really tends to limit you to like whatever happens to be open. So if location matters to you, like maybe professoring is not the thing, right? Like if that is an important piece in the puzzle of your life, if not having meetings, if you don't enjoy a frenetic lifestyle of like meeting, you probably don't want to be a leader in a school. Like that probably will drive you insane, so like thinking through like, what's your rhythm? How do you derive energy? And those things can help you, I think, in these decisions.
Yeah. And can I just jump in one more time to thank you all for not calling this podcast Alt-Ac anything? I was chatting with actually another ethnomusicologist who has, pivoted away, is also, well, actually now he's back in academia, but he worked in government and in nonprofits for a while. And he was like, I don't understand this Alt-Ac. This is not an alternative to anything. This is like my life. This is my thing. So yeah, I mean, and calling it alternative, and like I think the ways that academics have historically talked about pivoting out of your chosen field have also developed this weird like stigma around it. Right? Like you're not quite doing it well. When really I think now I am as happy and probably as well compensated as many of my friends who are still who are still in academia, and some of them are increasingly, less excited about being there.
Interesting how, like academia, just the structure of it, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, continues to push more and more and more on. Dave was talking about this earlier. So it does allow for that flexibility, but the workload just is, if you're taking off a couple of hours to go to an appointment, that workload then gets added to your evenings, and it's super complicated. And we appreciate you sharing your insights around this. And the decision to leave academia is something that we're going to cover a little bit more deeply on Not That Kind of Doctor later this season. So we'll take some threads from this conversation and pull those out to, as we do, create a spreadsheet or a flow chart. That's how I roll.
Or just think about, how do you make these decisions
using a
spreadsheet?
Using a decision tree.
Tree, yes.
Do you make decisions without a spreadsheet? At least a pro-con list?
I don't want to admit right now, but yes, and I heard something that both Julie and Dave said that I think was a major part of my tree. I keep it it's abstract, my tree. my pros and cons.
Yeah, we know it's
But-
abstract.
But yeah, it's very
We know this.
abstract. This is the only way I can create art is in abstract sense because I have no talent. But the
Limited mindset. Where's your growth?
The thing I heard here is that, and we talked about this even when we talked about where do you want to apply, and that is family is a big part. Family and friends and your community is a huge chunk of your decision making. And I heard Julie say we were in Jackson and we were like looking around and we're not excited to move to somewhere else just because somebody opened a job somewhere. And that's a huge part. Or Dave talked about, you know, we have aging parents and we need to take care of them and this is not viable anymore. So we need to have those cluster of opportunities, and we're encouraging our students, but definitely even if you're in your job 5 years or 6 years, even with tenure, it doesn't mean you have to stay. It means that you have to think, to be curious about what's out there, to keep asking and opening the options and really think about, and both of you talked about this really well, there's a cluster of things you know how to do that might be really, really great in other environments. And we don't think about them that way because it's like, I know how to do statistical analysis. Obviously, I need to write papers for publications that maybe 17 people read. Or maybe I can do something else with it. And so thinking about that is really important.
Or you could use those skills to create a dashboard that I would read every day.
Yes.
Like my kingdoms
That's
were
what
just
I'm
a
worried about.
dashboard. Like what are students doing? How is this working out? Like that's what I'm asking for. Give it. That's all I want. That's all I want. But, okay. So today we have covered a lot of ground from a narrow view of academia to some of the possibilities available beyond it. Thanks to Julie and Dave for sharing their stories about transitions, about identity shifts, and exploring those careers outside of academia.
Absolutely. And if you're thinking about a career shift, or even if you're just curious, start looking, start thinking about your skills and how they're transferable, because that really can give you ideas about what other careers. And I think both of you talked about the fact that you can make a real impact on in the world outside the walls of academia. And sometimes maybe even more difference as you're navigating what the universe is telling you about what you're supposed to be doing.
And so this is the first conversation in a multi-part conversation that we'll have on Not This Kind of Doctor. We've got some insights from this conversation on Not That Kind of blog, on notthatkindofdoctor.net. So be sure to look there. And just remember that you are not alone in making these decisions. We are all wrestling with the same kinds of questions about just life and existence, even if we don't talk about it, or have a multi-year, years-long text message chain about it. Julie, I'm looking at you. But remember, you're not alone. We're here to support.
And thanks for tuning in to Not That Kind of Doctor. And next time, we'll dive into another conversation that might help you think about what's possible.
She was, cats are awful. They just turn up their nose at stuff and,
Yeah,
they're just very picky for no reason. She used to live in a field in Locust Grove, Virginia, but now she won't deign to eat certain kinds of food.